There we go. Thanks for joining us once again. I'm Sammy K. Powers, and this is the PHP Roundtable. This is a live podcast of developers discussing topics that PHP nerds care about. And the ultimate goal of this discussion is to learn a little something from each other. If you're listening live and want to be a part of this little shindig, send a tweet to PHP Roundtable with a question and or snarky question or snarky comment, and we'll try to get that thing addressed live on air if we can. Today, we're getting all meta in PHP. And in order to accomplish this, we need to talk about DocBlocks, PSR-5, annotations, and reflection. But this ever-changing landscape of PHP that we're living in right now, the way that we add the meta information to our code bases is also changing. And we'll discuss the current state of meta programming in PHP and what we can expect of it in the not-too-distant future. So now that we know what we're talking about, let's meet our panel. And as always, in no particular order, we'll start off with Chuck Burgess. Chuck is on the PHP Documenter team, pair group, and now the PHP Fig core committee. When away from the keyboard, he is either running or driving an electric vehicle. Welcome, Chuck.
Howdy, howdy.
We also have Marco Pivetta, and Marco is a software consultant working at Rove. He's helping maintain the Zim framework and Doctrine ORM, and he's focusing on improving usage of the PHP language in the community. Welcome, Marco.
Thanks.
We also have Rasmus Schultz, who is a full-stack developer since 1998. Welcome, Rasmus.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. We also have Margaret Staples, who is a developer evangelist at Twilio and one of the secretaries for the PHP Fig. She's been writing code for the web for a really long time, but mostly refrains from yelling at you kids to get off her lawn. Welcome, Margaret.
Hello.
And finally, we have Alexey Gopachenko. He started PHP Storm 9 years ago and is now its lead developer and project manager. He leads a team of 12 inside of a team of about 300 people that are making IntelliJ-based IDEs at JetBrains. Welcome, Alex.
Hi, everyone. Probably I'm the only not PHP developer between you all guys. So I will give you a reverse look at PHP.
For sure. So since we're getting all meta in this discussion, perhaps we could start with the why of meta information. So this can go out to anybody, but why would we want to add any meta information to our PHP code?
Well, for me, it started from documentation, I guess. At the beginning, we just had a bunch of code. And if we were lucky, it was documented, which means that there was a separate file or something. Just to remember that on PHP 3, you had to actually remove comments because the files were evaluated line by line. So more comments means slower PHP. But that's no longer true. And that's pretty much where it started. I think we don't have him here, but Mike Van Riel worked a lot on the PHP Documenter project, and we pretty much copied over what was already happening in other languages, I think. But effectively, it starts from documentation. We need to, put some more lies on our code.
So I think from my perspective, there's essentially 3 different reasons for annotations, DocBlocks. One is documentation, yes. The other one is for static analysis inspections, both real-time inspections in PHP Storm and Visual Studio Code and so on, and offline static analysis with third-party tools like Fan and Stan, Mess Detector, Code Sniffer, that can use some of these annotations to enforce code quality standards on CI servers and stuff. And then I think the last reason is for runtime reflection and meta programming, which is not something that's like super widespread in PHP, I don't think. Symfony does some of that, but I don't think it's very common for like the average PHP developer to do a lot of reflective meta programming with annotations in their day-to-day work. Or any of you guys do that?
We do.
Well, yes. I even built a tool called Strict PHP, which just turns PHP into Java based on annotations.
Nice. I definitely want to talk about annotations and things, because that's I want to dive into that, because there's a couple of different branches we can kind of explore with annotations. But just sort of kind of keeping it high level, just kind of here at the beginning, is DocBlocks, are those the primary, or is it the only way that we can add metadata to PHP, or are there other ways that we can add metadata?
Yeah, I mean, it's the only way to annotate the source code, unless somebody invents their own new standard or something to put inside DocBlocks, which, I mean, they could. But it's not the only way to do metaprogramming. I personally, from 2011 to 2014 or so, I think, I did a lot of annotation-based metaprogramming. And then eventually I just learned different patterns. I mean, you can do metaprogramming by just writing classes that provide the same metadata. And then, you know, like you have like standardized interfaces, something like get metadata or something, and put that on the class, and then the classes can return metadata objects. It doesn't have to be done with reflection.
In PHP Storm, we basically need the metadata, and we care only about machine-readable part of documentation, not only static analysis, but basically completion, the stuff which is working value type, which gives all the awesomeness. So we need the type information, it's most important, and everything you can add, basically. So we have three types, three ways to add that. Basically, you could put it into the source code. Right now, we only have PHP doc for that. Second, you can put it externally. For example, you can create the same class, but with metadata. This is to augment frameworks, so you don't need to change framework code, so you don't need to modify anything. And also, we have we needed to invent something to do even more advanced stuff, like factories in frameworks, dynamic return stuff, containers. So we have a external metadata DSL based. It's PHP, but it's not used like code. It's not evaluated. It's like data structure. We just read abstract syntax tree and use that to see that your container call get my helper returns my helper class, stuff like that. And this is one of the most important unsolved issues right now. We don't want this to be proprietary. We need to some like standard for this.
Like a PSR, perhaps. I think we're actually going to be talking about a couple, at least two PSRs here coming up here in a second. I guess I really kind of wanted to have this episode because I started realizing something about me personally as a developer, is that DocBlocks I've seen most widely used to declare types on variables and properties. But as PHP is becoming more strongly typed, with each version, it seems like it gets more and more strongly typed. In PHP 5x, we were able to type arrays and classes, but that changed in 7, where they added scalar type declarations. And then in PHP 7.1, we got nullables, void, iterable pseudotype. We also got the object type in PHP 7.2, and almost making it into PHP 7.3. Made it into 7.4. It was kind of last minute, so but it was a really big PR by Bob Wynand and Nikita Pavlov, the Type Properties 2.0 RFC, which was just accepted yesterday. Woohoo! We need to eat some ice cream a little bit later to celebrate. But that gives you a way to add type declarations to class properties. And that is kind of the primary reason I actually use DocBlocks today, is to basically type properties on classes. I mean, I use them in a few other places. But does this mean that I'm a bad developer because I'm using DocBlocks less and less and just kind of relying on the PHP runtime to handle all this?
No, I think that means you're a good developer. I think PHP at the time was a bad programming language. One of the main reasons I started tinkering with with my own annotation library in PHP back in 2011 was actually because of the missing reflections for types. Like properties didn't have types, but we had already started annotating properties with types, and I wanted to leverage that information for things like, for example, binding a form post to a form model, and just wanted it to automatically perform typecasts on post data from a form and cast it to, like an integer actually becomes an integer and gets assigned to a property on a form model. Stuff like that was missing at the time.
We also
going back.
Okay,
go ahead, Alex.
Sorry, we also think that. Sorry, I'm used to use pronouns we when talking to public, but it's all my opinion officially, not company opinion. Still, we have like 700,000 customers, and basically we aggregate a lot of real world problems. So PHP docs are flexible. You could put anything in there, but this is a problem. There's very little common standards. There wasn't before PHP Documenter and PHP Storm was most biggest forces making PHP doc machine readable. And right now there are still some huge gray areas. So if you're using something which is enforced on you by compiler, basically, or interpreter runtime, this is better because it's like single source of truth. Definitely better.
So you're presumably excited about PSR-19.
Well, I have a long speech about that. We'll see.
Okay.
Chuck, you were about to say something?
Well, I was just going to point out that historically, PHP Documenter and the DocBlocks and such was really just to show you what the code wasn't able to show you at the time. So, I mean, as more capabilities have been added to PHP, some of the things have become redundant, and so therefore most people treat them as optional. But like I said, historically, those things weren't there, so this was a means for you to communicate what the code couldn't tell you.
And it still kind of is. I mean, there are either tighter or looser constraints than you can express with PHP type declarations. It could be useful, for example, to be able to do type unions. It's something that isn't supported by PHP yet.
And I guess one thing I would mention going forward is, even though all these additional things are in the language, that doesn't mean everybody's using them. So hopefully they are putting this information into DocBlocks if they're not going to use it in the code. At least if I'm going to be helping maintain it after them.
And it also really doesn't make you a worse developer as soon as you start adding more and more types to your system, to your project, to your library. You're going to reduce the amount of documentation that is needed to make it work. You're going to reduce the amount of ambiguity. You can introduce a lot of descriptive usages of how people are supposed to use your code. So yeah, it really, really helps.
True that, true that. So I thought I knew DocBlocks pretty well until I started preparing the show notes for this and realized that there's a lot about DocBlocks that I actually didn't know about. And there's a couple of things that I'm actually pretty excited about to try on in the next project because I'm obsessed with developer experience and documentation. And I feel like there's a lot of areas where I could improve my documentation experience by making use of DocBlocks, which I want to talk about a little bit later. But I kind of want to talk about DocBlocks as a whole in that I say DocBlocks like all the time, just DocBlock this, DocBlock that, but DocBlock is actually more of an umbrella term, I realized. And it encompasses a subset of descriptors that we can associate with structural elements in PHP. Specifically, DocBlocks are doc comments that contain valid PHP docs. So I kind of want to break this down. So the parser, the PHP parser, actually treats certain comments different than other comments, right? And that's how we can make DocBlocks work?
Right, 2 asterisks. for the ones for the DocBlocks you want to be able to access via reflection. So the reflection API has something like a get doc comment for class reflections, property reflections, method reflections, and that's how the annotation frameworks access the that piece of content that has to be parsed for the PHP doc syntax itself, which PHP doesn't parse.
Yeah, and you need to have a reflection symbol. So as far as I know, it works on properties, methods, classes, but it doesn't work on things like function calls. It doesn't work on constants because we don't have the actual annotation symbol on a constant.
It also doesn't work on files.
Does it actually work on files? Never tried.
I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah, because it's not a reflection symbol, actually. So you can't ask for PHP here. I have a reflection file. Tell me what is in it.
Right. We don't have a file reflection, so.
And it should be also clear that accessing these annotations has a huge performance impact, because there are two things that need to happen in order to read them properly. The first thing is you need to have them enabled in the upcache settings. So you may land or deploy on a server that has annotation support removed. This happens because the PHP language may optimize them away and remove them from the so-called compiled opcodes. And the second thing is you are going to go through reflection. Now, reflection is quite fast in PHP. It's not as slow as in other languages, especially compiled languages, but it has an overhead. So you are actually introspecting the code, and the code may change location. A lot of things can happen there. So need to be careful about it. Hence, it's generally suggested to use them only during compile time steps. So not at runtime, not when the server is running, but when you deploy, when you are, or if you run them once and then you cache whatever you see. So you prevent accessing and repeating this access multiple times, because it's actually very, very expensive.
Right, but the frameworks that like for Symfony and the PHP annotations framework that I wrote, I mean, they do cache. So once the hard work of parsing PHP doc, I mean, that's where the real overhead is. The overhead of just getting the text is really quite small.
Yeah, and I've heard from a lot of internals people from way back in the day saying, don't use reflection, it's slow. And I think that sentiment that you all are echoing is that if you cache it, then you have this initial, like, we're going to use reflection to do what we need to do, like DocBlocks, or maybe auto-wiring a container or something to do some dependency injection. There's lots of really cool things we could do with reflection, but I like what you're all saying, just cache it and then it's faster. But cache and validation is one of the hardest things in programming, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But don't get it wrong. Reflection in PHP is quite fast. Cool. The idea that reflection is slow comes from other languages, like Java, for example. When you're reflecting a class, what's happening is that you're going under the hood. You're asking things to the engine that the engine may have optimized away. In PHP, we're lucky enough that the engine is not optimizing away things. I mean, that's both positive and negative for us, which means that reflection is pretty much as fast as any other class instantiation yet. So don't worry too much about that. If you see new reflection class, it's not the end of the world. In Java, maybe it is.
I'm really curious about the AST layer, which is this new thing that we got in PHP 7, the abstract syntax tree. And if I know that if you have a library installed, like I think Nikita Pavlov has a library out there that allows you to access the AST. Can we use the AST to grab DocBlocks or PHP docs?
Absolutely. Sorry if I'm always talking here, but you were mentioning the reflection and grabbing DocBlocks, and we released Rove Beta Reflection a few months back, version 2, that actually allows you to do that. And it actually uses Nikita's library, which is called PHP Parser, in order to actually fetch information from files, and you can ask questions like, here's a directory, please tell me everything that is in there. And it can do that without loading the code. That's the big advantage. When you got AST, you can process code without actually evaluating it. And before, we actually had PHP just load the code into memory, do whatever it has to do to actually evaluate it. It's like you only have eval in order to work with reflection. And that is a problem, especially if you're downloading code from somewhere and you want to look into it without, downloading a virus or something.
True that. So once we actually get the DocBlock pulled out, whether we're using reflection or pulling it out of the AST layer, like the actual the DocBlock contains PHP docs, I guess, right? There's a couple of different types of PHP docs, or I should say entities, not to confuse types, because I was having a lot of trouble with the show notes. I kept saying types, but types means one thing in PHP, it means another thing in DocBlocks, and then it's like there's different variations of PHP docs, but I don't want to say different PHP doc types because that's a different thing. So could you help us break it down such that we understand PHP doc a little bit better?
I think that was maybe Mike's attempt to put some hard terms around pieces when you got to the point of trying to actually break the components of a doc block down into parsable pieces. No, run that question by me again.
What are some like what are some examples of like a PHP doc can contain PHP docs, right? Like it can have a summary, description, and tags and things like that. Is that kind of how I understand it?
I can tell you how exactly bad it is. I mean, generally, the structure is absolutely has no any formal structure. I mean, it's certain lines have the so-called PHP doc tags in them. They start with ampersand, they have some name, and after this particular tag, maybe some tag like method or param, the rest of the line just basically change semantics completely. I mean, some symbols which are valid in one tag will be completely invalid in another tag, and there is no general like grammar for them, stuff like that. For example, also by default there are no multi-line tags, so tags end by the end of line. But for example, if you have a doctrine style annotation, you have to treat this in special way, basically counting the braces, so because it can span multiple lines, stuff like that. And actually PSR-5 is the solution for that, because it introduces some like basic syntax to make this machine friendly, and but there are still some like huge gray areas. I can give some examples, but if you wish.
Well, at least for the annotations, we have a formal grammar, the doctrine annotations. But that's a different corner. We didn't even go there yet, I think.
Yeah, most important part of PHP doc tags is the type description, like you say. Like it's the type for particular symbol, for example, a method or function parameter, or return type, or maybe variable type also. And for method tags, basically types for all method has, parameters, and the syntax for those types is like, there will no syntax before when we started PHP Storm. For example, people just wrote something in there, for example, like array, and then just continued in plain text. Array of something, or otherwise, if no result, for example, false. So this is when we have to invent something. For arrays, we use Java notation or C notation, basically name of type and square braces, like the most straightforward thing. And it was quickly adopted by users and then other projects. And then second thing, then people try to express stuff like array or false. Basically, we invented this that is called now the union types. So the array, basically, or false, which basically looks like expression you're familiar with, and it doesn't change much in what you was writing before, except removing the or key word. And basically, we generated all the header files for standard PHP classes and changed the default text human readable descriptions from the website to more machine-like readable. So that's why we have like a more complex syntax. But basically, type definition is like either simple type name or class name, or a combination of them. PSR-5 tries to mitigate that and expand on that. For example, introducing like better collection types, other things. But there is much work to be done, actually.
Also have intersection types now in the next EAP. So PHP Stan has been introducing those. So when we were used to this type is either A or B, which is generally a bad idea. But it is pretty much standard, especially for nullability. Now you can have A and B. So this is very useful when you have magically composed classes like this is an A and also a mock. So we are very sure that this is a mock of A. And in that case, the intersection type makes more sense.
So it's different from a union type, whereas a union type is like this type or this type. We don't, like during the runtime, we might get either. An intersection type is like it's both of these things.
Yeah, so this is the stuff that is only possible because the language has no way to express this at a type level. And it's also very, very hard for the language to generally convey types because if we were to, introduce types everywhere, then in PHP we have this concept of a zval, which is kind of like the box that contains a variable, and it moves around. And this zval, all what happened in PHP 7 was mostly about reducing the amount of data that is in such a zval and in which kind of zvals exist and so on. And if we add the type informations to this data structure again, we would basically make PHP 7 as slow as PHP 5 again, because PHP is runtime evaluated, anything can happen. So if we were to say this thing has to be locked into an integer and it needs to be and stay as an integer, we would have this additional memory usage in every variable that says you can't assign a non-integer here, and that's a problem. So that's why it stays in documentation. It will probably stay in documentation for a long time.
Yeah, such complex cases is where then you cannot change the runtime. This is there you having a better tooling helps. For example, you can express those types and have better completion than you editing, and then you can run tools like PHP Stan on CI, FL, like consistently check across your entire project. This is very important.
So I want to look at the time. Go ahead. Was that Chuck who just chimed in? Or was it Marco?
I'm talking too much.
Well, I just kind of want to make a transition over to looking at some of these types, because I think there's in DocBlocks you can say bool or boolean, and so there's a couple of types that don't exactly translate over to PHP, which would expect bool, not boolean. I remember when we first got scalar type hints, I was typing boolean everywhere, and it kept saying, "There's no class called boolean. What are you talking about?" I'm like, bool is the keyword I'm looking for. But I'm curious. Are we, maybe hearing from the kind of PHP Fig kind of way of thinking of things, are we trying to standardize how we write the types in DocBlocks? Is that kind of the purpose of PSR-5 and PSR-19?
That would be fantastic.
That's definitely part of PSR-5. But I think for legacy reasons, it will support both bool and boolean, but probably bool will be recommended, for example. Because it's the actual type hint in PHP, obviously.
Yeah, in PHP Storm, basically you edit your code, so you create your code there or change it. So the idea is we accept everything we can understand in less ambiguous way, at least. Or even for some things we have even a setting. Like this is a very old school project. We write the param tags without $. This is something like that, but we only generate the most like consistent and correct from whatever grammar we have at the moment of this version of PHP Storm. In 9 years, it's changed somewhat, fortunately to the better side. But yes, the tools should generate the basically standardize the code and to make it interchangeable. But yes, for many years, we will have to read the old stuff.
Well, but the tool can only generate stuff when you can infer it. So anywhere it's inferred, it's not really in need for a type anyway, for a type declaration. So if you have, I know this is reality nowadays, but according to yesterday's merged pull request, which is the type properties, let's say that you have a constructor. I can actually make a demo. If you have a constructor, I'm going to open the IDE just to show it. I know it's a commercial tool, sorry.
It's not going to work on the radio, though.
Effectively, if you're generating a constructor and you add a parameter and you say this is a Boolean and it will generate, it can generate getters, it can generate setters, it can generate properties. None of these are required according to the new RFC acceptance. The only reason where I would see this as required is now in those types that we cannot yet infer, which or we cannot actually declare in the language, which are effectively the things like union types, like things like intersection types, generic types, which we don't have yet. So we're inventing our own again. So let me actually see if I can do this.
So, I mean, I think I'll just add, you're completely right that a lot of the type annotations that we historically had to add, like say return types, that we had to add with DocBlocks, and now you can add them as real type hints, and you don't strictly need the DocBlock anymore. What you do still need them for is, of course, for documentation. So we do still need them, and this was one of the last issues I brought up with PSR-5 before it completely stalled. The fact that the old PHP doc syntax doesn't make the type hints optional, so you can't do add return or add param without putting an actual type in there, which means you're forced to duplicate everything. I think that's one thing we have to address with PSR-5. We have to come up with a solution for that.
So you're basically saying that we will not have, or that the standard would advise not to add the duplication in your view? Or?
No, I'm saying it needs to be optional. The syntax of the add return annotation, for example, the syntax of it right now is that you have to put a type hint in there. It's not optional.
Yeah, basically, if you generate a doc command to put what this parameter specifically is, like for human, you have to generate type, even if it's easily inferred and it's like primitive type or something like that.
Yeah.
And basically, a tool will maintain it for you. But why? Nowadays, you can just skip the generation. In PHP Storm, we can just make an option, but still, it should be like allowed by standard, because then PHP documenter, for example, won't generate proper documentation. And second thing also is relevant to this, for example, to duplication. I mean, from type-related or PHP doc-related issues right now, OpenTracker, like in top 50 most voted with hundreds of votes, is like remove the entity name duplication, for example, for parameters, because you have to write the name twice. Why do not use order? Because some people maybe I don't see the point, but still this duplication is a problem for some people.
Well, it's a problem if, for example, you change the return type of a function and you don't notice that there's also a DocBlock where the type hint is duplicated, and you need to always remember to change it in two different places.
Well, inspection in PHP Storm will tell you even before commit. You made the incorrect change, and I guess PHP Storm will do it. PHP Stan, for example, do it on your CI with the warning level. It's runtime error.
But still, I mean, I guess there's no good argument for duplicating information that's already present in the source code.
But right? You should, I guess, in the point of making errors, especially like in the editor, this is very different from editor is very different from like compiler or interpreter, because most of the time it has totally incorrect code. You just starting to open, type something, and basically have the, for example, param tag line completely consistent by itself, param name, type and name, and some description. You can move it, for example, and do not lose something. And people easily spot they have the wrong name or wrong type, but if they have like wrong order without name and type with some details, it's harder for people to spot. So it's like a tricky question.
Yeah, but the order would not be sufficient anyway, because what happens is that, let's say that you have a signature where you have an array, and then you have an integer, then you have an array again. Now, for example, in the doctrine coding standards, this is required. It is required for you to document the two array types, and it is forbidden for you to document the integer type unless you put a description of what that that boolean, whatever it is.
Excellent.
So it actually forbids you to document stuff that is redundant, and it automatically removes this stuff from the DocBlocks. But it enforces that anything that is an array or an iterable or a countable or something like that cannot just be left as is. You need to specify an array of what.
Yeah.
You can't
because
just
otherwise you get mixed. Yeah.
And therefore the positional argument would not work, because then you would just duplicate all the time anyway.
So yeah, we close the issue and inform everyone this is the standard now. Good.
Well, you can link it to me. I'll give this argument, and you can close.
Sure. We just make it. Sorry.
I do want to kind of look at kind of the status of PSR-5 and PSR-19, because I know that for a while there, it kind of it was going somewhere. PSR-5 was going somewhere, and then it kind of got stalled for a little bit. But I think we've got Chuck is on. You're the editor for PSR-5 and PSR-19 now, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So and then Margaret, as a FIG secretary, what is your role in the PSRs? Do you push people to be like, all right, we got to get this thing out, or are you saying like we need to change this way, or what's your role for that?
I'm a cat herder. I herd cats. Basically, I just make sure that everybody understands what the status of every PSR is, and I try and determine whether or not there's any interest in moving it forward, if it's stalled out, and just try and get it back on track. And it's just cat herding. That's really my whole job.
Nice. So has there been much activity in terms of working on any of the PSRs related to DocBlocks recently, or?
Well, I had gotten I had worked on at Tech splitting the original PSR-5 as it was left off into two standard definitions. One to describe the format of DocBlocks and tags and such, and another to enumerate the tags that have historically been used, going mostly based on what PHP Documenter has tended to always use. So,
can I actually ask here, I'm maintaining also the doctrine stuff, and I put in quite some effort to, for example, stop Zen Framework in 2011 from implementing annotation its own way, and just saying, just pick the existing library, please. Is there anything considering also that, which is not PHP Documenter annotations? It's like completely different. Is there something in the document about that? I'm not following the document yet.
Well, about the only things that Mike and I had originally put in the documents regarding annotations was trying to leave room for annotations if they were going to be some kind of standardization wrapped around them later. Because from a PHP Documenter perspective, it was just, let's define what we need to define without putting up a roadblock for whatever annotations are already out in the wild. So as far as the PSR-5 structure document, at this point, it kind of mentions we're aware of annotations. We're trying to define this structure to where we won't hinder any standardization efforts as far as annotations go.
Gotcha.
Annotations is, I feel like I have a whole section dedicated to annotations in the show notes, but since it's kind of getting close to wrap up time, I don't even think we're going to be able to really talk about it. And there's an RFC out there. I think Rasmus, you're the one who created the Simple Annotations RFC, correct?
Yeah, I did. That was, I don't know, that was just kind of a brain fart, to be completely honest. There had already been an attempt to standardize. There had already been an RFC trying to standardize an annotation syntax for PHP. And I think from what I gathered, part of the reason it failed was because it was just way too complicated. And yeah, I sat down one evening and tried this and just said, okay, so what is the absolute minimum? What's the least thing you can do to actually put metadata in there? And the idea that I came up with was just allow any PHP expression, and whatever values you put in there, whether they're objects or strings or numbers or anything you put in there, you can get them just as a list of those values. Like most software that consumes annotations for reflection purposes, like for metaprogramming, is going to scan the list of annotations anyway to try to find the the annotations of a certain type so that they can get certain types of metadata from those. If they're going to do that anyway, then I don't know. That seemed like the simplest thing you could do was just allow any value to be put in there.
Any constant value that has no side effects, basically.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
You would hope.
Yeah. I mean, but for example, the doctrine annotations have a side effects. When you load them, you're actually calling the constructor of a class somewhere, and that's honestly problematic. So you wouldn't be able to do that in typical PHP code because you put, cause auto-loading and other things. So it makes sense to, just have an annotation, which is just an array or something like that. You just put an array on top of a class, and that's it.
Loading a class in itself doesn't necessarily cause side effects. I don't view loading a class as a side effect. If that was a side effect, then PHP is only side effects.
Oh yes, PHP
because everything gets loaded on every request. So
yeah, but no function calls. Then every time you load the annotation, it looks differently.
Yeah, sure. But any code that's inside a PHP file gets executed, right? Hopefully nobody puts code inside a class file just to make it execute when it loads, but you can.
Yeah, I'd love to have a separate episode on annotations, because I feel like we can really open Pandora's box on this one and talk about how it's supported right now with DocBlocks, but also how some of there's a couple of other RFCs that have come up that kind of hint at adding annotations to PHP natively with some syntax. I think Hackling has annotations with the angle brackets or something like that, if I remember correctly. I'm just kind of going off the top of my head here. I'm just waiting for some nods or something. Maybe yes. I don't know. Okay. But
things like noise and stuff even built in the language. So annotations that are already out of the box provided by the language.
Yeah. Well, I do want to kind of start wrapping up here because we're kind of getting really close to that time. I do know one thing. I as I'm kind of exploring other languages, I've been kind of digging into Rust a little bit, and they have this really cool thing called RustDoc, and they also have their own doc comment, and it's 3 forward slashes instead of just the standard comment for the double forward slash, and it basically will convert everything that's in those triple forward slashes into markdown supported HTML formatted docs. And I'm like, that's so cool, we should do that in PHP. And then I remembered we've had this for a really long time. You can do this with PHP Documenter and DocBlocks because they fully support markdown and everything, right?
Yeah, I don't think that's actually cool. I like to keep my documentation as minimal as possible, because the more you document, the more you have to sync up with the actual code. Code that needs documentation is generally bad.
For example, if you type in your code inside of editor needs to render maybe some parameter hints for you really neatly. And if you put some like formatting in there, won't work really. I mean, in terms of usability and stuff.
But also, just a question to the others. When was the last time you generated the documentation from a project?
Excellent question.
When did you do it last time? Come on, let's start from Alexey.
I mean, I stopped reading Java doc generated, the original for all these good doc generators. I think 10 years ago, I always using quick documentation in my IDE in various and other more smart assistants, and I never generated them basically.
If I could have my way, I would get rid of inline DocBlocks in PSR-5 and add Markdown instead, because the only thing inline DocBlocks are used for is for things like links and see this other class. And then, I don't know, I think Markdown is just better for rich text than trying to squeeze DocBlocks into the comment content.
People put tables there. I mean, HTML tables.
Yeah.
Really.
Nice. I think
it's like going too far. If the code needs that level of documentation, either it's broken or it was not well designed. High-level documentation should not be on a symbol inside the code. It should be like, here's a README of the project. Yeah, if you put it on the class that you're using, and then you have like a function with that much code, and 3 pages of documentation, something is really, really wrong, in my opinion.
Unfortunately, we have this with PHP core classes like iterators, I think something like that, or like SPL style array objects, and lots of there, and especially list of constants you should pass to old style functions. It's hardcore, and we have some solutions ready or suggestions ready for discussion if you wish.
Well, I do want to talk about this in a future episode, because I really would love to get all y'all's opinion on like tightly coupling documentation and code, because I do see a trade-off there. I see the value of tightly coupling it, because it's often that when your code changes, your documentation is some way over here in some other place that it's easy to get out of sync. And if it's right there in the code, maybe it's easier to keep it in sync. But as you said, there's lots of trade-offs to having it right there in the code. These giant like 100-line documented doc block right above the class. That's another trade-off to have, right? But since we're getting so close to wrapping up time, I do want to give a couple shout-outs on Twitter. People who are chiming in who want to have their question and or snarky comment addressed. And Scott Schultz is looking for some help documenting PHP doc guidelines. I think Scott is working on getting a team together and getting them all up to date on DocBlocks and what to do. Is there a good resources to point Scott to and everybody else who's curious about diving deeper into DocBlocks?
I mean, you've got the tag manual on PHP Documenter's website, I guess, as a base to go to.
And PSR-19 will be the good point.
Someone should say PSR-5, so I'm going to say that. I know it's unstable and it's not a standard yet, but there are some pretty solid descriptions of the tags that are in PHP Documenter. Why do you use tags?
Yeah, and if you look at the code of PHP Documenter, which is probably a bit too much there, you can actually find the list of classes which are actually one-to-one to what is supported in the DocBlocks.
Very cool. Also, Stefan Hardorfer mentioned, hopefully someone will mention Disco. What's Disco?
Oh, yes. Well, Disco is a dependency injection container, which was pretty much picked from Java's Juice. I don't know how it's pronounced.
Juice.
And yeah, it's a dependency injection container built by some guys, some people at Google, sorry. And Yeah, what they did is they put on annotations on a class, very normal class, and on those specific methods that are annotated, when you regenerate or recompile the application, you get some different behaviors, such as memoizing a return value or making a certain thing a named service, so you can ask it for it by name instead of calling that method. It's not necessarily, come on, Rasmus, you need to try it. But anyway, the point is you have a class that is your dependency injection container that looks like a factory. You can run static analysis and whatever on it. So it's just plain PHP code without, XML or fancy configuration or other things, or even worse, YAML. When you add those annotations, it decorates it with additional behavior that would otherwise be very hard to add.
Like AOP before after point cut?
It's pretty much AOP, yes, it's pretty much AOP. I think it's actually done the right way. It's not necessarily the coolest thing, but compared to other dependency injection containers out there, it's most likely the simplest one.
Cool. One last tweet from actually one of the panelists, Alex, and it was actually in response to the tweet that I had posted from the PHP Roundtable Twitter account that had a screenshot of using DocBlocks above a for each loop, showing how you can add IDE syntax highlighting by saying that all the things inside this array are of this type. Of course, I got actually by about 1,000 people. Like, actually, if you properly annotated this property in the first place, you would have just used like a typed array sort of annotation above, or not, I shouldn't say annotation, DocBlock above that particular property in the class. So as like if you have an array of the guest objects in this case, you could just do guest open and close bracket, right, to show that everything inside this array is of type a guest instance, right?
Yeah, with the type of key and value might be inferred if the property or variable of like iterable or array type is documented properly. This is the idea. And if you have this class definition in one place, you only need it once, and you can iterate in many places, and you don't need to repeat yourself.
And you can enforce that it's actually added to your code base by using coding standards. There's like Slevomat and Doctrine coding standards. They both allow you to say, anything that is an array or that is an iterable type, you have to document it. I think this has been said 3 times now already. Please document your arrays. Don't give arrays to people.
No, PHP Stan supposedly is really good at this inference stuff when it does static analysis.
There's even better. I looked at Vimeo's Psalm. Vimeo's Psalm, they even have annotations for documenting things like closures, where you can document the parameter type, the return types. You can actually write generics with it. It's not necessarily the best thing because it's still living in the documentation, but you can put something called a template. It's called a template on a class, and you can say this is a parameterized class which has a parameter t, and then you can add it to methods, and it will, link them together. The class level annotation with the method level annotation with a closure inside the method annotation and so on. Very, very
I actually proposed that for PSR-5 years ago. And I think there's still an open pull request for that, but the whole thing stalled.
One more thing from Twitter, and then we'll wrap up. Andrew Woods just chimed in. What information should be included in the file level header? So are we talking about DocBlock? I'm guessing if you put a DocBlock over the file structure, like what does that look like? I think
copyright notice.
I'm sorry.
A license and copyright.
Yeah, don't do that.
Is that the 2 things that are supported?
No. Yeah, just don't do it at all. If you have a license in your repository, you're fine, and you don't need to do it on every file. That's okay.
Yep.
Yeah, file level DocBlocks kind of an artifact from way back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like the Facebook PHP SDK has a giant license thing at the top of every file. It's kind of fun.
Yeah.
Absolutely. All right, cool. So I think it's time to wrap up officially with some shameless plugs, and we can get out of here. In no particular order. I'm just going to go in the order I can see you on Google here. Alex, do you have anything that you want to shamelessly promote?
Yeah, we have the best type inference out there, definitely, because and we constantly improving it. For example, recently we have a type system which will track the security for you, like basically all across code paths. So you will have a real-time vulnerability analysis and stuff like that. And we would like to provide this as a standard for everyone in future.
Very cool. What about you, Chuck? Do you have anything you want to promote?
I'll jump off the jump out to the driveway and say 0 motorcycles. Get yourself an electric motorcycle and see what instant torque feels like.
Oh wow, that sounds scary, honestly, but fun at the same time. How about you, Marco? You got anything you want to promote?
As I said in the intro, I'm a consultant. I work for a company called Rove, and we pretty much focus on domain-driven development and Zen framework-based development. So focus if you need any help.
Very nice. What about you, Margaret? You got anything you want to promote?
Twilio for all your communications API needs. If it is communications and not email, we have an API for that, including Authy for 2FA, all of the things. And also Twilio.org if you were doing a software project on top of the Twilio platform that accomplishes some sort of social good, connect with Twilio.org. We want to facilitate that. And also PHP Fig, support PHP Fig, volunteer your time to PHP Fig. Thank you.
Awesome. What about you, Rasmus? You have anything you want to promote?
Open source. Share your code. That's it.
Awesome. Yes, open source for the win. So we have quite a ton of actual episodes in the docket, in the queue, ready to be done, ready to be produced, whatever. One of those is GDPR for PHP devs. That's been on the docket for a long time. I think it's about time to get that one actually out finally. All things Drupal's another one. A live accessibility audit of the phproundtable.com website, so that I can be embarrassed by all the ways that it's not accessible. But we're gonna do it live so that hopefully we can all learn this stuff together. If you have something that you would like to share, a topic about PHP or something that PHP nerds care about, send an email to me. I actually have a form on phproundtable.com you can fill out, or just hit me up on Twitter. I'm Sammy K, or ping the PHP Roundtable on Twitter. I would like to thank Alex, Chuck, Marco, Margaret, and Rasmus for joining us in this discussion, and we'll talk to you folks in the next episode. Peace.